So, of all the books that we're going to be reading this semester, Frankenstein is the one that I'm sure you've heard the most about. However, unless you've read this book before, you probably also have the most misconceptions about this book as well. So let's begin by saying some healthy expectations to have. So, Frankenstein is a horror novel through and through. But the horror in this book doesn't really come from the horror of being hunted by a monster, although that's certainly present. The horror in this book deals with the wickedness in man's hearts, original sin, and the common duties that we all ought to have toward each other, particularly in father-son type relationships. Frankenstein is one of my all-time favorite works of literature, and would be my favorite work that we're reading this year if we weren't also reading Crime and Punishment as well, which is tied for Frankenstein in my book for first place. So hopefully you all are going to enjoy this book just as much as I do. Now, with regards to reading this book, there are several things that I'd like you guys to watch out for. First, make sure that you read Pastor Biggs' Guide to Frankenstein that is posted on the course page. He has a lot of helpful thoughts in there about some general things that you'll want to be considering as you read through it. For myself, here are 3 things I'd like you to be looking out for in the book. First, pay attention to side stories. One thing that you'll notice about this book is that it begins with a series of letters from a character who isn't really all that relevant to the main plot of the story, and so you're going to be tempted to just skim the beginning letters just to get to the real meat of the story. But there are a lot of important lines in this section, so it's important to read it with the same attention as you'll give the rest of the story. In the middle story, there's another section again, where a lot of focus is given to some characters who don't seem to matter to the rest of the plot. But again, pay attention. Both of these side stories have a lot of parallels to the main plot, so try and look out for what similarities you can find between these side stories and the main story. Second, look out for the analogies that are made between Frankenstein the monster and God and Adam. A lot of this book has a lot of analogies to the biblical narrative of the creation and the fall in Genesis 1 through 3. There are also a lot of analogies that are being made to Paradise Lost. Now, for those of you who haven't read it, Paradise Lost is an epic poem written by the English poet John Milton about Satan's temptation of Eve in the Garden of Eden. If you have read it, try to pay attention to how Shelley interacts with Milton's depiction of the fall. But even if you haven't read it, there is still a lot you can glean just from how Shelley interacts with Genesis 1 through 3, so pay attention to these analogies. Finally, you're going to want to think about whether or not Frankenstein's monster is fully human. One of the major conflicts in this book is an argument between Frankenstein and his monster about whether or not the monster is truly human. So pay attention to their arguments and try to decide for yourselves whether or not you believe the monster is human, and more importantly, why. So there are my 3 things to look out for while reading Frankenstein. Mary Shelley was a fierce romantic and was not a Christian, and you can perhaps see a fair amount of veiled attacks on Christianity in this book, attacks that we'll be discussing in class. So read with discernment, but read with engagement, because there really are a lot of really interesting themes in this book to discuss. I can't wait to discuss this book with you guys next week, so talk to you guys then.